We have found a document about the Spartans and the Jews, indicating that we are related and that both of our nations are descended from Abraham. 1 Maccabees 12:21.
Dare we ask, did Abraham really exist? The mysterious figure Abraham, embedded deep within the biblical narrative, conjures fascinating queries. Might there be echoes of other myths that connect to the Abraham narrative? Yes, echoes, and dare I say, myths. If we're being audacious here, let's also claim that Abraham's tale might not be etched in the stone of history, but instead in the parchment of allegory. We're on a quest for truth, and not just any truth, but one that doesn't sugarcoat our sensibilities. Consider Peter J. Leithart, a figure I may not always nod in agreement with, but who serves a cogent point as a voice of faith. He notes,
evangelicals are debating the historicity of Adam, but they are too timid. It is time to reject fundamentalist distortions of the Abrahamic narrative, just as decisively as we have abandoned literalistic readings of Genesis 1-3. Clinging to discredited biblical accounts of Abraham as if these events actually happened makes us look like Neanderthals, undermines the plausibility of our witness, and ultimately overturns the gospel. To defend the gospel and uphold the authority of the Bible, we need to reckon with the myth of Abraham.
Leithart's clarity is akin to a refreshing splash of cold water, especially for someone like me, who navigates ancient texts with a secular compass, regardless of their cultural origins. Yet, despite his insights, Leithart still seems to hold the Bible as a divine artifact rather than a human creation. The conundrum remains. The tangible evidence for Abraham, let alone the events in Genesis, is as elusive as a desert mirage. Take, for instance, Abraham's sojourn in Egypt in Genesis 12. Uncannily reminiscent of Israel's Egyptian saga, which too seems more allegorical than actual. Whether these narratives stem from shared literary motifs or direct modeling, the debate remains. As scholars passionately debate these tales' origins, positing multiple authors across epochs or perhaps a single Hellenic-influenced scribe, we must ponder, if Abraham is less man and more motif, what message lies encrypted in his story? Our journey might find its compass pointing towards Greece. While the influence of cultures like the Mesopotamians, Canaanites, and Egyptians on biblical texts is almost universally acknowledged, the Grecian whisper in the scriptural tapestry remains understated. Yet, I remain convinced of this Hellenic echo. The vast Greek Septuagint, intertwined with biblical tradition, offers tantalizing clues. People imagine the Greeks as full-on pagan polytheistic peoples. However, the elite philosophers like Thales, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were the original gangsters of monism, with an ultimate divine power that rules over the divine lesser beings. The later Christians and Jews are in many ways indebted to these thinkers. And yes, for those who followed our previous explorations into Russell Gmirkin's insights, brace yourselves for another scholarly expedition into Abraham's possible Grecian roots. Join us as we wade into this confluence of biblical Greek connections. Let the Odyssey commence. Abraham's story in a nutshell. Born around 2170 BCE in the prominent city of Ur, Abram, later named Abraham, was a central figure in biblical history. Moving to Haran after the death of his brother Haran, he married his half-sister Sarai at 75, and he heeded a divine call to relocate to Canaan. Accompanied by Sarai and his nephew Lot, his story opens up with the immediate promise of a land that God will show him, and that he will be a great nation. Facing famine, they took refuge in Egypt, where, fearing for their lives, Abraham presented Sarai as his sister, afraid the Egyptians would kill him for her beauty. Mind you, Sarai is 10 years younger than Abraham according to these texts. So here's a 65-year-old woman who must have been smoking like a 20-year-old Playboy model. Odd detail. Their deception was uncovered, leading to their expulsion. Back in Canaan, tensions between Abram and Lot's household forced them to part ways. After Lot's capture in a regional war, Abraham heroically rescued him, and he bumped into Melchizedek, king of Salem, who was a high priest of the Most High God. Many questions abound for this figure. Anyways, around this period, Abraham lamented his lack of an heir, though God reassured him. Sarai offered her maid, Hagar, to bear a child. Hagar bore Ishmael, but tensions arose, leading to her exile. Can anyone say Jerry Springer any faster? Later, God renewed his covenant, renaming Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, foretelling the birth of Isaac and introducing circumcision. 3 divine visitors confirmed Isaac's upcoming birth and also warned of Sodom's impending destruction. Despite Abraham's intercessions, Sodom was destroyed, though Lot escaped, albeit the tragic consequences of his wife turning into a pillar of salt. Oh, and his 2 daughters drugging their father with wine to sleep with him to carry on a seed. In Gerar, Abraham, fearing for Sarah's safety again, called her his sister. King Abimelech took Sarah, but returned her upon realizing the deceit. Shortly thereafter, Isaac was born. Now, who's the real baby's daddy here? Abimelech or Abraham? Anyways, following more disputes involving Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham banished them, but they were divinely protected. In a supreme test of faith, God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. As Abraham obeyed, an angel intervened, providing a ram as a substitute. Sarah passed away at the age of 137 years, and Abraham secured a burial site in Machpelah. Abraham then arranged for Isaac's marriage and had more children with his second wife, Keturah. Ensuring Isaac was his sole heir, Abraham passed away at 175 years of age and was buried beside Sarah by Isaac and Ishmael. Eventually, his son Isaac would have children named Jacob and Esau. Then Jacob would get the promise and be renamed to Israel. Israel's favorite son was Joseph, who would get them into Egypt. You gotta read the story. And eventually they would become slaves for 430 years, all to have Moses take them on an exodus to the promised land, with Joshua leading victorious battles to get what God promised Abraham at the outset. The quest for the historical Abraham. Searching for Abe. From the hollowed echoes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical authors have painted vivid portraits of iconic figures, treating them as historical luminaries, regardless of some of the rather eyebrow-raising assertions. Abraham's age of 175? A walk in the park compared to Adam's whopping 930-year tenure. Through the annals of history, historians and ecclesiastical scholars, with fervor akin to investigative detectives, have endeavored to tether these biblical tales to the realm of historical accuracy. Their tools? Intricate genealogies and comparative historiography, striving to lend the patriarchal chronicles an air of authenticity befitting the second millennium BCE. Yet, as time's relentless march continues, our academic arsenal has evolved, providing sharper instruments for dissecting the veracity of these age-old tales. The unquestioned existence of these biblical heavyweights was the modus operandi, even for the most discerning scholars, until, that is, the 20th century's latter half bestowed upon us a plot twist. Upon uncovering the intricate tapestry of sources that constitute the Genesis and patriarchal narratives, theories abounded. The documentary hypothesis, the supplementary hypothesis, and their scholarly siblings arose, all questing to reconcile the improbability of Moses single-handedly penning this voluminous work. By the 19th century, that notion had all but retired to the annals of antiquated thought. As we embark on this documentary, we'll be dancing on the shoulders of academic titans, luminaries like Thomas L. Thompson, John Van Seters, Russell Gmirkin, Philip Wagenbaum, Philip R. Davies, and dare I say Neil Godfrey have not just entered the field of Old Testament studies, they've rocked its very foundations. Thompson and Seters in the 1970s, in particular, have swayed scholarly consensus from assured affirmation of the patriarch's existence to an enlightened skepticism, suggesting the upbeat nature of an archaeological quest for their remains. Thompson's magnum opus, The Historicity of the Patriarchal Narratives, fittingly culminates this sentiment. So fasten your intellectual seatbelts, dear viewers. This is going to be a cerebral ride.
We have seen in the foregoing chapter of the received tradition about Abraham's journey from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan by the way of Haran is not an originally independent tradition about Abraham. Rather, it is a historiographical reconstruction which is based on several originally independent and conflicting traditions, if not only must be understood as unhistorical, but any attempt to find movements analogous to Abraham's in the history of the Near East are essentially misdirected for the purposes of biblical interpretation. The intentions of the biblical traditions about the patriarchs are not comparable to those of the modern historian. They are rather sociological, political, and religious. Those attempts at interpretation of these traditions which willfully neglect the implications of their formations and structure can justly be dismissed as historicism. Moreover, we have seen that the biblical chronologies are not grounded on historical memory, but are rather based on a very late theological schema that presupposes a very unhistorical worldview. Those efforts to use the biblical narratives for a reconstruction of the history of the Near East in a manner comparable to the use of the archives of Mari and similar finds can justly be dismissed as fundamentalist. Though we have argued that the quest for the historical Abraham is basically fruitless occupation both for the historian and the student of the Bible, the question about the historical background of the patriarchal narratives is a question to which the historical criticism, with the help of the ancient Near Eastern history and archaeology, can give very concrete answers.
In 1974, this piece of writing was so scandalous when it emerged that its author, Thompson, found himself facing a decade-long involuntary vacation from employment. By 1992, his academic antics led to an unceremonious exit from Marquette University's hallowed halls. From the disco-infused 70s to the grunge era of the 90s, he, alongside the likes of Philip R. Davies, Niels Peter Lemsky, and Keith W. Whitelam, was knee-deep in decoding the enigma dubbed ancient Israel. Their work wasn't just groundbreaking, it was earth-shattering, especially in the world of Old Testament studies. Much of his brilliant banter, most of his argumentation, was centered around names of the patriarchs, as Thompson says in his 1974 book.
It will be my contention throughout this process of historicizing Genesis is a serious error in biblical interpretation, and to the extent that it depends upon the evidence we have from Near Eastern nomenclature, totally unfounded. Some questions which must be asked of our evidence are: do the names really demonstrate or make more probable the historicity of the patriarchs? Do they help to date the period in which the patriarchs belong? Do they support the thesis that the narratives of Genesis mirror the history of the second millennium, specifically the movements of the Amorites?
Ultimately, Thompson broke the consensus on Abraham's historicity. Most critical scholars these days have forsaken the attempt to finding Abe. If there ever was a guy, he's lost to us, as is his sons, all the way to Moses. If there ever was an Exodus, it is absolutely nothing like the Bible describes it. The same can be said about the united monarchy with King David and Solomon. The more we dig, the more scandalous it seems that the Bible is not historically accurate. But is that the author's goal? Are they trying to convince their readers and hearers of a fake history, as Plato recommended in his writings? Russell Gmirkin has spoken several times about Plato's noble lies and how to create a great nation. In the historical pursuit of the biblical patriarchs, many scholars equipped with both archaeological tools and scripture sought empirical confirmation of these iconic figures. In Egypt, one is presented with names from First Immediate Period, circa 2181 to 2055 BCE, associated with Abraham and believed to be Amorites. This association arises because of the phonetic resemblance to the Amuru from South Mesopotamia, emerging around the same epoch. Parallelly, the Hyksos, linked to Jacob and Joseph, are perceived as invaders with Amorite affiliations. Curiously, it's the nomenclature of these patriarchs that seemingly connect these historical dots, allowing scholars to interpret these tales as condensed history of the Near East during the second millennium. Thompson's scholarship underscores that these patriarchal names weren't exclusive to the second millennium BCE, but echoed into the 4th century BCE across diverse locales, including Mesopotamia. The existence of Abraham has often been posited on the corroborative elements like the geographic references in Genesis. However, it's essential to note that these places endured well into the Hellenistic era. Thompson delves deeply into the significance of Abraham's name in this context. I proffer a contention. When drafting foundational stories of a nation, it's likely that authors might retroject their primeval figures into antiquated settings, lending a veneer of authenticity. Take, for instance, the esteemed archaeologist Israel Finkelstein. He views the biblical narration of Canaan's conquest in Joshua as less of an authentic historical account and more as a late 7th century BCE ideological blueprint depicting an inspirational conquest under King Josiah of Judah. Finkelstein hypothesizes that this conquest narrative possibly originated in Israel's northern kingdom around the early 8th century BCE, inspired by the remnants of past disturbances. This perspective gains weight considering the lack of archaeological traces for many cited cities, or their emergence only in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. How can one validate a 12th century BCE conquest of cities that archaeologically appear half a millennium later? By this logic, the absence of evidence for Moses' mass exodus from Egypt could whimsically be attributed to celestial beings equipped with dustbusters. Such narratives, likely embellished retellings of pure literary creations, often weave in contemporaneous nuances, inadvertently revealing their true temporal origins. To draw a playful analogy, discovering a gospel where Peter cruises in a Honda Civic would unmistakably hint at a narrative crafted in a more modern milieu. Similarly, Genesis contains anachronisms that point to its later historical genesis, pun intended. In our preceding video explorations, we've journeyed through the tapestries of myth and lore underpinning Genesis 1 through 11. Now, as we delve into the tales of Abraham, there's a prevailing sentiment that we've anchored ourselves in the firm ground of historical narrative. Numerous commentaries underscore this demarcation, suggesting a transition from myth to reality, right between Genesis 11 and 12. For some scholars, this transformation commences even earlier, with Genesis 11:10 enveloping Terah and his kin's expedition from Ur to Haran in the cloak of history. Over time, I've developed a certain affinity for those discerning minds who interpret these passages as masterful narratives rather than concrete history. This naturally begets the query: when was Genesis scribed? A significant portion of the scholarly community posits its creation during the exile or perhaps the post-exile era, with a handful placing bets on the Persian period. It's paramount to note that their perspective primarily hinges on the priestly source, though not all contend that Genesis, in its entirety, emerged during these times. Today, I aim to illuminate the Hellenistic shades painted on Genesis, post the epoch when Alexander the Great unfurled the essence of the Greek world upon the vast expanse known biblically. Neil Godfrey curates a thought-provoking blog, the link to which is available in the description below with all the sources. His writings delve deep into concepts that sometimes take a while to permeate American scholarly circles. Of particular note is his discourse on Niels Peter Lemke, which I found to be intellectually stimulating. Here are some points in favor of a Hellenistic date after 300 BCE for the Old Testament. Number 1. It is a fact that the history of Israel, as told by the Old Testament, has little, if anything, to do with the real historical developments in Palestine until at least the later part of the Hebrew monarchy. 2. An extensive part of this literature should be considered the creation of the Jewish diaspora. First and foremost, the patriarchal narratives, the story of the Exodus about the Israelites in Egypt and their escape from Egypt, but also the conquest narratives in Joshua. All of these aim at one and the same issue, at the more or less utopian idea that a major Jewish kingdom, even empire, should be established or re-established in Palestine, an idea that emerged in spite of the fact that it had no background in ancient Israelite empire. Number 3. The writers who invented the history of Israel seem to have modeled their history on a Greek pattern. Herodotus, being the earliest point of comparison, there are a number of similarities between the histories of Herodotus and the Old Testament. Both histories have as their beginning a perspective that encompasses the whole world as such, and this perspective narrows down to single nations only at a later point, respectively the Greek and the Hebrew. The biblical historians display a knowledge of Greek tradition, and this could hardly have been the case before Greek historians were to become known and read in the Near East. Number 4. The Persian period does not seem to fit the requirements of being the time when the historical books of the Old Testament were written down. First of all, it would have to be proved that Greek authors were known and extensively read in the Persian Empire, and I very much doubt that this was the case. Lemke goes into far more responses to this issue of a later dating of the Old Testament, but consider it as we dive deeper into this documentary. Philip R. Davies, an esteemed professor of biblical studies at the University of Sheffield, delves deeply into these matters. His assertions have sparked fervent debates within academic corridors. Davies contends, based on archaeological evidence and rigorous analysis of the biblical narrative, that the biblical Israel is more myth than reality. He posits that figures such as Abraham and Moses are not historical entities, and kingdoms attributed to David and Solomon did not exist as described. According to Davies, the biblical depiction of Israel might have been crafted as late as the Persian era, challenging traditional chronologies. Problems with dating the Old Testament to the Persian era. We have very little information about the Jewish population in the Persian era. We have almost nothing apart from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the historicity of these books has also come under scrutiny. Some doubt there was ever even a mission by Ezra. The autobiography of Nehemiah may be no more historical than many other similar examples of autobiographical genre in the Greek world. Biblical historians have traditionally written of the period of Persian rule as time of peace and prosperity. Judah was allowed administrative independence. Jerusalem was organized as a prosperous temple burgher society. But the evidence we have could just as easily be interpreted otherwise. That Judah's independence may be more comparable to modern crumbling societies left on their own and with a great deal of administrative independence to provide a sad picture of local incompetence. Maybe they did not interfere in local affairs because they did not care. The Temple Burgher Society has nothing more than hypotheses to support it, and the account of a band of Greek mercenaries being able to waltz through the empire, kill a Persian governor, and walk out again in Xenophon's Anabasis is evidence of Persian administrative incompetence. The archaeological evidence we need for the Persian period is not likely to come to light. Israeli archaeologists have demonstrated a contempt for the Persian period and removed its remains to rubbish dumps in order to get down to the real Israelite layers. Lemke cites A. Mazar's Archaeology of the Land of the Bible, 586 BCE, as illustrative to this attitude. As for the Hellenistic period, it should never be forgotten that the revitalization of the ancient Near East only became a fact after the Greek takeover. It is an established fact that city life vastly expanded after the conquest of Alexander. Here we must realize what happened in Jerusalem and in Palestine. Innovations that were comparable, although on a smaller scale, to the cultural developments in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Scholars may nurse very romantic ideas about what may have happened in the nooks and crannies of pre-Hellenistic Palestine, in a society considerably poorer than the one found there. For example, during the Late Bronze Age. A more worldly and realistic assessment of facts suggests that the Persian period was not the time when the Old Testament could have been written down. Hardly any parallel exists to such a development, but a lot of evidence that says the Hellenistic age was the formative period of early Jewish thought and literature as witnessed by the Old Testament itself. I would refer everyone to Jonathan Adler, the archaeologist, who is confirming much of these statements. In Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, Russell Gmirkin delves into an intriguing premise. He postulates that a myriad of laws within the Hebrew Bible draw parallels more closely to the works of Plato rather than the traditions of the ancient Near East. Both Gmirkin and Philip Wagenbaum theorized that Plato's philosophical treatises were seminal influences, shaping the biblical author's formulation of idealistic national laws. Russell Gmirkin on Foundation Stories. When we look at Greek literature, we can see that the biblical tales of the Israelites' exodus under Moses and their conquest under Joshua are quite similar to the Greek foundation stories. Even though this kind of storytelling wasn't common in the ancient Near East, it was very popular among the Greeks during the Hellenistic period. This section delves into the common themes in Greek foundation stories and how they compare to Moses leading the Israelites to the Promised Land. Greek foundation stories can be set in different eras. There are mythical times, that's when gods and humans lived together before major floods, like that of Deucalion or Noah. There's legendary times marked by heroes and ending around the Trojan War, and the more factual, archaic, and historical periods. Direct interactions between gods and humans were limited to the mythical and legendary periods. In later times, people would seek advice or guidance from the gods at temples or sacred sites. While some stories were entirely set in legendary times, most foundation tales started with the promises of land made during this era, but the actual settlement happened in the more factual, archaic, or historical periods. Promises of ancestral lands are a recurring theme in many Greek foundation tales. They serve as a foundational myth that supports later conquests and settlements of specific territories. Often these promises were made to renowned heroes like Heracles, Aeneas, or members of the Argonaut expedition. As these heroes journeyed, they would pass through territories that their descendants would eventually settle. Often, gods like Apollo would grant these lands to the heroes during their travels. Even if the heroes settled elsewhere or even passed away in a different land, their divine claim to these lands would be handed down to their descendants. It might take several generations before the descendants actually settled these promised lands. A famous example of this narrative theme is Heraclius' adventures, where he received divine rights to various places during his Mediterranean travels. This narrative style was also used to justify the Spartans' colonization efforts, citing Heracles' journeys. Another example is the story of Cyrene in North Africa. As per the accounts of poets Pindar and Apollonius of Rhodes, when the Argonauts arrived at the Libyan coast, Poseidon's son gave Euphemus a symbolic chunk of Libyan soil, marking it as a territory under his rule. This token of rulership was passed down until Battus, a descendant, founded Cyrene in Libya. Another special case is Aeneas, who after the Trojan War journeyed the Mediterranean but never visited Latium's promised land. However, he was prophesied at Troy that his descendants would create a city, Rome, destined for greatness. Drawing parallels, Weinfeld highlighted the similarities between the land promises given to the biblical figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and those given to heroes like Heracles and Aeneas. The stories of these patriarchs served as a prelude to the foundation of the Israelite nation by Moses and Joshua. Similarly, Greek tales about ancient heroes and foundational ancestors provided a historical context for subsequent movements and conquests. The Israelites' journey and settlement into the Promised Land mirrors Greek myths like the return of the Heraclids, usually foundation stories, which explain how a group settled in a new territory, begin by detailing the problems that made them leave their original home. These issues could be overpopulation, famine, disease outbreaks, natural disasters, economic problems, internal conflicts, forced exile, military defeats, or escaping potential conquest and enslavement. In one ancient Jewish story written by Hecataeus of Abdera, around 315 BCE, it's said that Egypt became overpopulated, leading the Egyptians to send settlers to places including Babylon and Judea. Another tale from Manetho, written around 285 BCE, claims that Jerusalem and Judea were first inhabited by the Hyksos, foreign rulers who took over Egypt, but were later forced out by the Egyptians due to a disease outbreak linked to the Hyksos' ungodly practices. In contrast, the biblical Exodus story, written around 270 BCE, presents a different viewpoint. The Egyptians faced plagues as punishment for enslaving the Israelites, and only after suffering these calamities did the Pharaoh let them go. This narrative of escaping from bondage fits the pattern of Hellenistic foundation stories and is a consistent theme in biblical tales. The well-known practice of the Egyptians using slave labor for grand projects such as building pyramids reinforces this narrative. While the miraculous rescue of the Israelites is unique to the biblical account, their quest for freedom aligns well with Greek tales. A pivotal moment in the Exodus story is when God chooses Moses to be the liberator and guide for the Jewish people. This revelation occurs when Moses, in exile from Egypt, discovers a holy site in the Sinai desert. God informs him that he has been chosen to lead the Israelites out of Egypt to a new homeland with Aaron's assistance. Although hesitant and unsure, Moses accepts this significant responsibility. In the biblical story, Moses' divine selection to lead mirrored a common trend seen in Greek foundation tales. Typically in these tales, an oracle, usually at the famed Delphi sanctuary dedicated to Apollo, would choose the leader, termed oikist, for a colonization mission. This oikist held various roles: expedition head, military leader, spiritual guide, and law enforcer. It was a reoccurring theme for these leaders to be unexpectedly chosen. Guidance for their journey, including specific landmarks and signs to determine settlement areas, often came from the Delphi oracle. On some journeys, a prophet or spiritual guide accompanied the leader, aiding in establishing the new settlement. The biblical account showcases the Israelites as an organized, armed group, constantly prepared for battle as they journeyed from Egypt. Moses was their military strategist, but their triumphs, whether in battle against various tribes or major exodus from Egypt, were attributed to the divine intervention of Yahweh. This description of the Exodus sets the stage for the next phase, the conquest, where Joshua takes over Moses' military role. Throughout these narratives, the main emphasis is on the armed men. Women, children, and livestock are seen as under their protection, while the fighters are the focus of accounts and are explicitly numbered. The portrayal of this migration, then, is of an armed group transitioning from one territory to conquer another. This depiction aligns with Greek tales, where colonization parties often journeyed as armed contingents. It's at Delphi that Apollo, recognized as the god guiding migrations and settlements, was consulted. In the Bible, Mount Sinai serves as the pivotal spot where God communicates with Moses. This return to Sinai in the Exodus narrative is the backdrop for the profound moment where Moses climbs the mountain and receives God's commandments. In Greek tales, the leader often revisits the Delphi oracle for advice on pressing issues. This trip back to the oracle sometimes left the expedition group alone for extended times, akin to Moses' 40-day stay on the mountain. Moses, as the lawgiver, fits seamlessly within the Greek narrative structure. In Greek tales, the oikist typically established laws for the new settlement. Historical accounts and legends often credit ancient law codes to singular prominent figures, such as Lycurgus or Solon, who sometimes were believed to have received these laws directly from deities. Established processes even allowed for proposed law codes to be presented at an oracle, like Delphi, to gain divine approval. While Greek narratives often depict lawgivers getting divine laws via specific ceremonial methods, the Bible portrays Moses directly meeting God at Sinai amid an awe-inspiring natural display. At Mount Sinai, Moses supervised the creation of a special tent and its items. This tent wasn't just a place of worship, but was believed to be the dwelling place of God. As the Israelites traveled through the wilderness, God was thought to accompany them within this tent. Moses was the main spiritual leader for the Israelites during their journey, much like the oikist in Greek stories. The oikist was also a religious leader, representing the god Apollo during their colonization missions. When the Greeks ventured into new territories, they believed they were also relocating their gods. A sacred fire symbolized this move, which they used for religious rituals during the journey. Apollo's famous sanctuary in Delphi often gave them guidance on where to settle and build their new sanctuaries. In the Bible, before entering their desired land, the Israelites sent scouts to check it out. However, they were disheartened by the challenges they'd face in conquering it. As a result, they spent 40 years wandering, during which the entire soldier generation died. Similarly, in some Greek tales, explorers were sent first to assess new lands. These colonization efforts, whether in myth or real history, often faced challenges. They might take much longer than expected, sometimes spanning several generations. There were times when the settlers even thought of going back to their original homeland due to homesickness or settlement challenges. Both the biblical account and Greek tales emphasized the importance of establishing foundational laws and systems for their new societies. For Israelites, after their 40-year journey, there was a renewed emphasis on the laws, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. This highlighted how they should live once they settled. All these guidelines were officially approved by the community and were meant to be publicly displayed in their new homeland. Similarly, when Joshua took the people across the Jordan, he quickly set up an altar and inscribed these laws, ensuring they were practiced. Like in the Bible, Greek colonization stories also focused on establishing foundational laws for their new territories. The leader, or oikist, who was similar to Moses, set these laws. The oikist laid down rules about political, religious, and military structures, the society's class system, land distribution, and citizens' rights. Just as in the biblical narrative, these laws were approved by the community, usually with rituals and oaths. Often these guidelines were inscribed on stone tablets for everyone to see. When the Israelites reached the Promised Land, they were coming back to the original home of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This story reminds us of the return of the Heraclids in Greek tales. In both stories, a divine command encouraged the takeover of the local people. Similarly, the journey of Joshua in conquering part of the Promised Land matches Greek stories about the founding of new colonies. In both the Bible and Greek tales, the deity presents the land as a gift. The conquering colonizers believed they were not just allowed, but obligated to take over. Most of the time, the native people were either defeated and enslaved or forced to move. Sometimes the takeover was explained with a moral reason, adding it to the legend. The oikist, or colony leader, often became a revered hero due to his military leadership, but starting a colony wasn't always smooth. The newcomers often faced challenges from locals. which sometimes made the Greeks rethink or give up their plans. Just like how the Greeks felt shame for not taking over the lands given by their god Apollo's oracle, the Israelites were also criticized in the book of Judges for not fully conquering their promised land. The oikist had various responsibilities, including picking up the main city's spot, creating religious areas and structures, organizing festivals, and dividing the land among the settlers. The actions of Joshua during the conquest phase bear a lot of similarities to Greek colonization accounts, as detailed by Weinfeld. Once the colony was fully established, its completion was marked by the death of its founding figure. The later generations would remember this founder and would often dedicate a special cult to honor them, usually at their burial site. For colonies set up in the historical times, these burial sites were typically in the city's central area. In legendary tales, the exact location of the burial might be lost to time. While Moses' burial place remains a mystery, the burial sites of Joshua and the chief priest Eleazar were highlighted, suggesting these founders were deeply respected. The tradition of the oikist often involved a yearly celebration that remembered the founding of the colony under the oikist's leadership. One of the most famous such celebrations was the Dorians' Carnea festival, honoring the establishments of Sparta, Thera, and Cyrene. The Carnea was initially a festival that celebrated farming, paying tribute to Carnus, an old ram god. Later, this god was associated with Apollo. Apollo Carneus signifies Apollo as the guide of migrations. Much like how a ram leads its flock, its particular aspect of Apollo is credited with guiding the Dorian movement to Sparta and other colonization efforts. The 9-day Carnea festival had various activities like the sacrifice of a ram and a recreation of a military journey, which includes dances with weapons and parades with miniature ships. Interestingly, aspects of the Carnea have similarities with the biblical Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Both started as agricultural festivals, spotlighting the sacrifice of sheep. Over time, these festivals became significant national events, reenacting migration tales. The Passover, in its evolution, portrayed the story of Israelite beginnings, similar to how Carnea portrayed Spartan beginnings. This suggests that the Passover might have been influenced by Greek foundation narratives and festivals that Jews encountered in the early Hellenistic period. The biblical tales about patriarchs and the events like the Exodus and the conquest fit the mold of the Greek theses or foundation stories. But every story has its unique elements. For example, while some Greek colonization tales spoke of escape from slavery or lawgivers being divinely inspired, the biblical Exodus and the laws given at Sinai are described with divine miracles not commonly seen in Greek stories. The writers of Deuteronomy recognized these special aspects of Israel's foundation narrative. In Deuteronomy 4:32-34, highlighted the exceptional nature of Israel's origin story, especially the direct involvement of Yahweh as the savior and provider of laws, setting it apart from other foundation tales known primarily in the Greek contexts. National Foundation Myths, Greeks and Jews. In a discerningly pinned blog post, Neil Godfrey delves into the intriguing parallels between Phrixus and Isaac. Such a comparison, he asserts, is indispensable when examining Abraham's narrative. One cannot sidestep the intertwined tales of Isaac or Jacob. Abraham stands as the proverbial patriarch of the Jews, celebrated not only for the inaugural covenant of circumcision, but also for his heart-wrenched act of near sacrifice of his beloved son, Isaac. Godfrey's insights are underpinned by Philip Wagenbaum's seminal work, Argonauts of the Desert. Through rigorous contemplation, Godfrey offers an astute interpretation of Wagenbaum's contentions, showcasing his commendable grasp on the subject matter. Godfrey expresses it this way. Philip Wagenbaum in 2008 defended his anthropology doctoral thesis, Argonauts of the Desert, Structural Analysis of the Hebrew Bible. He applies the structural analysis of myths as developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss to the Bible, something Lévi-Strauss himself never got around to doing, although he did eventually encourage biblical scholars to do so. In Wagenbaum's words, for Lévi-Strauss, a version of a myth is always derived from an existing adaptation, originating most of the time from a different culture and language. A myth must always be analyzed in comparison to its variants within the same cultural area where contacts between populations are proven. Wagenbaum is analyzing the Bible narratives as myths, though he concedes they may contain some historical elements, and comparing the accounts with narratives and laws from Greek literature. While ancient Near Eastern literature offers many laws similar to those in the Bible, he thinks the Greek literature has not been explored in this context to its full potential. I am already wondering about the gospel narratives and the relationship between Jewish and Greek mythical and literary culture in this context, Godfrey says. For Lévi-Strauss, similarities between myth that may appear as coincidental at first look must be investigated more deeply. This investigation may ultimately reveal that the analyzed narratives are actually variants of the same myth. Lévi-Strauss builds a very strong case for his arguments in his analysis of Native American myths. The story of the bird nester can be found in hundreds of different variants in every part of both South and North America, proving that the same initial story spread itself through millennia of oral diffusion. Lévi-Strauss describes how the order of the episodes of a myth can be reversed from one variant to another, and that many motifs can be inverted. Lévi-Strauss sought to discover universal rules of transformation in all myths, similar to the discovery of universal principles in structural linguistics and phonology. The aim of Lévi-Strauss was to show that mankind thinks everywhere the same, that there is no objective distinction between so-called primitive and civilized thoughts. Parallelism is not a dirty word, like the proverbial hammer that cares not whether it is used to build a house or bash the skull of a prisoner. Analyzing parallels can serve valid and good and invalid and bad functions. Parallelisms must not be analyzed in an isolated way, but one must try to find out the possible narrative structure that links the similarities together. In other words, the similarity is not sufficient by itself to speculate about any possible borrowing. We must examine the place and role of these in their own contexts. Phrixus and Isaac under the microscope. Godfrey continues. So with the context of the methods of Lévi-Strauss in mind, no one will jump to the conclusion that the well-known parallelism between the Greek myth of Phrixus and the binding of Isaac indicates a source-derivative relationship. What will be needed after examining the parallels is an examination of the place and role of these stories in their own contexts. That step will probably have to wait for the next post, Godfrey says. Here is the Phrixus myth in hopefully a quick, easy-to-read ladder with a crucial key noted in step 10. 1. Athamas, king of Boeotia, married Nephili, a cloud goddess created in the image of Hera by Zeus. 2. Athamas and Nephili had twin children, a son, Phrixus, and a daughter, Helle. 3. Athamos afterwards rejected Nephili and married Ino. 4. Ino hated her stepchildren, Phrixus and Helle, so plotted to have them killed by their own father. Number 5. Ino bribed messengers who told King Athamos that the Oracle of Delphi, speaking for the god Apollo, required the sacrifice of Phrixus on Mount Laphysian in order to end a famine in Boeotia. Number 6. Just as Athamos was about to sacrifice his son Phrixus, Zeus, or Nephili in other versions, sent a golden winged ram to rescue Phrixus and Helle by flying away with them. Number 7. Helle fell off, hence the Hellespont, Helle's Sea. Number 8. The ram brought Phrixus safely to Colchis, Georgia. Number 9. In gratitude, Phrixus sacrificed to Zeus the golden ram that saved him and hung its golden fleece on an oak tree. Number 10. Now, while it may seem quite inconsequential, probably the most important ingredient of this myth is that it is the prologue of the epic of the Argonauts, who will come to Colchis years later to bring the famous Golden Fleece back to Greece. The significance of this will become apparent in my next post, where I begin to compare the structured context of this myth and the binding of Isaac. We can recognize the resemblance to the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. To test the faith of Abraham, God orders him to sacrifice his only beloved son on Mount Moriah. Abraham submits to the command and binds his son. At the last moment, God sends an angel and interrupts the sacrifice. Abraham sees a ram stuck in a bush and sacrifices that ram instead of his son. But note the inversion of one small detail. In the Greek version, the ram is killed first. Then its fleece is hung in a tree, whereas in the biblical version, the ram is first stuck in a bush and sacrificed afterwards. This inversion of detail can lead us to wonder whether these stories could both derive from a common source. One could derive from the other, or that the resemblance is only due to coincidence. Therefore, we must examine the place and role of these stories in their own contexts, respectively, the epic of the Argonauts and the biblical narrative. Godfrey continues in another blog with his astute observations. See Godfrey's comparisons here. One, you've got this divine command to sacrifice one's son. It's real in the case of Isaac, a lie in another in the case of Phrixus. Phrixus' stepmother bribed messengers to tell the father that God required the sacrifice. One, the father's pious, unquestioning submission to the command. 2, the last-minute deliverance of the human victim by a divinely sent ram. Direct command to the father in the case of Isaac, direct command to the sacrificial victim in the case of Phrixus. 3, the fastening of the ram in a tree or bush. Before the sacrifice of the ram in the case of Isaac, after the sacrifice of the ram in the case of Phrixus. 4, the sacrifice of the ram as a substitute for Isaac, as a thanksgiving for Phrixus. What is significant is that these narrative units in common to both stories exist at a level independent of the particular stories. They can be inverted, reordered to create different stories. The question to ask is, are these units similar by coincidence, or has one set been borrowed from the other? That particular detail about the ram in the tree or thicket is certainly distinctive enough to justify this question in relation to the whole set. Firstly, given that it is no longer considered quote-unquote fringe, except maybe among a large portion of American biblical scholars, where the influence of conservative and even evangelical religion is relatively strong, to consider the Bible's quote-unquote Old Testament books being written as late as the Persian or even Hellenistic eras. And given the proximity of Jewish and Greek cultures, the possibility of direct borrowing cannot be rejected out of hand. Secondly, the chances of the Jewish story of the binding of Isaac being influenced by Greek myth is increased if both stories are located in a similar structural position within parallel narratives. Both near-human sacrifice narratives serve as the prologues to larger tales of 1. Divine promises of a land to be inherited by a hero's descendants. 2. A special divinely chosen people. 3. A prearranged time schedule of 4 generations before the land would be inherited. 4. Deliverance through a leader who initially protests because he stutters. 5. An additional delay because of human failure to hold fast to a divine promise. 6. A wandering through desert with a sacred vessel. 7. Guiding divine revelations along the way. Not only are both tales of escape from human sacrifice prologues to these larger comparative narratives, but they also serve as a reference point in both. They hold the respective larger stories together by serving as the origin point of the divine promises that guide the subsequent narratives of journeying to a promised land, and that origin point is referenced by way of reminder throughout the subsequent narratives. The biblical narrative is about much more than the way the children of Abraham inherited the land of Canaan. And here is where Philip Wachbaum, in his 2008 doctoral thesis, Argonauts of the Desert, Structural Analysis of the Hebrew Bible, draws attention to the extensive similarities between Plato's writings and the Bible's narratives. Both contain a general flood, being the beginning of a new era in civilization, with a patriarchal age following, the rise of cities and kingship, and the development of laws, and a description of an ideal state. The laws in the Pentateuch are often remarkably alike the laws proposed by Plato. You've got laws that require a central religious authority. You have laws of a need for pure bloodlines, especially for priests. Laws that condemn homosexuality, witchcraft, magic. Laws of inheritance, boundary stones. Laws of allowing slaves to be taken from foreign peoples only. Laws against the need for a king. Laws governing involuntary homicide. Laws regarding rebellious children. Laws against usury, against taking too much fruit from one's fields, and quite a few more, and often found listed in the same order between the Greek and Hebrew texts. The ideal state, moreover, is divided into 12 lots of land given to 12 tribes. The king, it is warned, is subject to the vices of love, and this will lead to oppressive tyranny. One might think here of the sins of David and Solomon. Wagenbaum applies the structural analysis of myths as developed by Claude Levi-Strauss to the Bible, and one can see his coverage is much more extensive than can be covered in a few blog posts. Here is where Godfrey is focusing only on structural place of the Phrixus, Isaac sacrifices in their respective wider narratives. The Phrixus episode serves as an introduction to the adventures of Jason and the Argonauts. And this set of adventures functions as an explanation of the founding of the Greek colony of Cyrene in North Africa, Libya. The Argonaut epic and the Bible narrative. Neil Godfrey earlier written a series of 6 posts on the resonances between the Argonautica as told by Apollonius of Rhodes. They are found by starting at the bottom of this Argonautica archive, but this post is addressing Wagenbaum's thesis. The full Argonaut epic is found in Pindar's 4th Pythian Ode. It had earlier been referenced in Homer's Odyssey, Book 12, 69-72, and Hesiod's Theogony, 990-1005. and in Herodotus, the foundation of Cyrene and the interrupted sacrifice of Phrixus. Euripides wrote 2 plays titled Phrixus, now lost to us. And of course, Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the epic poem in imitation of Homer, the Argonautica. The main sources for this epic relate it to the founding of Cyrene. Pindar's ode is even dedicated to the king of Cyrene. This compares with the early Bible narrative from Abraham to Moses, relating to the settling of Canaan. Jason, leader of the Argonauts, belonged to the same extended family as Phrixus, all being descended from Aeolus. Zeus was angry with the descendants of Aeolus over the attempted sacrifice of Phrixus by his father, and to appease his divine wrath, Jason embarked in the Argo with a band of followers, the Argonauts, to retrieve the golden fleece. This was the fleece of the ram that had saved Phrixus at the last moment from being sacrificed. Triton, son of the sea god Poseidon, appeared in human form and gave one of the Argonauts, Euphemus, a gift of a handful of Libyan soil as a token of a promise that his descendants would return and colonize the land. Had Euphemus succeeded in keeping the soil to plant appropriately in his own home area, his descendants would have returned to colonize only 4 generations later. But since the soil was washed overboard and its particles landed on the island of Thera instead, 17 generations would have to pass, and Cyrene would have to be colonized by the descendants of the Argonauts after first settling in Thera. This is the reverse of the order in which we read of the sacrifice and the promise in the biblical narrative. There, Abraham is promised a land and afterward prepares to sacrifice Isaac. The Argonauts seek to appease Zeus's anger of the attempted sacrifice of Phrixus by retrieving the fleece of the ram that saved him, and the promise of the land of Cyrene for the descendants of the Argonauts is made afterwards. Generations later, after the descendants of the Argonauts had settled on Thera, a direct descendant of Euphemus was commanded through the Delphic oracle to lead his people to settle and establish Cyrene in fulfillment of the promise made at the time of the Argonauts were retrieving the fleece of the ram that had saved Phrixus. This descendant was known as Battus, a name that means stutterer. He argued against the divine command on the ground that he was not a great warrior and that he had a speech impediment. But the Delphic oracle refused to listen to reason and made him do as he was told anyway. This sounds like Moses. Herodotus tells us that Battus ruled Cyrene for the familiar 40 years. That doesn't sound familiar. We are reminded of the promise to Abraham that his descendants would settle in Canaan after 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Egypt serves as a delaying detour on their way to their destiny, as Thera was in the Greek myth. God commands Moses to lead his people to Canaan by invoking his promise to give it to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses at first refuses by pleading that he stutters. If Battus ruled the Argonauts for 40 years, Moses, also once called a king and known as a king in Philo, led his people for 40 years also. This narrative structure, joining Abraham to Moses, echoes with accuracy the promise made to Euphemus and its fulfillment by descendant Battus. Both Moses and Battus invoked their trouble speaking in order to avoid their divine mission, and both ruled over their people during 40 years. Therefore, the similarities between the interrupted sacrifice of Isaac and that of Phrixus appear as part of a similar narrative structure. It seems as though Abraham plays 2 different characters from the Greek epic: King Athamas, who almost sacrificed his son Phrixus, an episode from the beginning of the epic, and the Argonaut Euphemus, who received the promise of land for his descendants, an episode from the ending of the epic. The order of the episodes has been reversed. In the same way, the detail of the ram hung on the tree after the sacrifice in the Greek version appears inverted to the account of the ram stuck in the bush before the sacrifice in Genesis. To repeat a few lines I quoted in my earlier post, this is Neil Godfrey speaking, but this time without the omissions. Parallelisms must not be analyzed in an isolated way, but one must try to find out the possible narrative structure that links the similarities together. In other words, the similarity between Phrixus and Isaac is not sufficient by itself to speculate about any possible borrowing, but when placed in the wider framework of the Epic of the Argonauts and the foundation of the colony of Cyrene, it allows us to question a likely influence of the Greek mythical tradition on the writings of the Old Testament. Philip Wagenbaum notes that his thesis supports the one advanced by Jan Willem Wesselius. In The Origin of the History of Israel, Herodotus's histories as the blueprint for the first books of the Bible, that the narratives in Herodotus have influenced the biblical narrative. But there is one significant clue thus far missing. Wagenbaum's remarks. What might the founding of a colony in Cyrene in Herodotus have to do with the settlement and kingdom established in Canaan by Israel? Wagenbaum points to an answer. We must investigate the writings of another famous Greek writer to find the description of a state meant to be a colony, a state that would be divided into 12 tribes and ruled by perfect God-given laws, the ideal state imagined by Plato in his laws. How late was the Bible, and who really wrote it? Neil Godfrey again comes through, as has Russell Gmirkin and several of the scholars we've brought up so far. But I'm impressed with what Neil puts here. Here's what he has to say. It has become a truism that the Bible, or let's be specific and acknowledge we are discussing the Old Testament or Jewish Hebrew Bible, is a collection of various books composed by multiple authors over many years. All of these authors are said to have coincidentally testified to the one and only true God of the Jewish people. The mere fact that multiple authors spanning generations wrote complementary works, all directed at the reality of this God working in human affairs, is considered proof that we are dealing with a cultural and religious heritage, a common tradition belonging to a single people over time. A few scholars have challenged that thesis, and the most recently published of these is Philip Wagenbaum. He writes, to have a single writer for Genesis through Kings, and possibly for other biblical books, contradicts the idea of the transmission of the divine word and of a tradition proper to a people. The idea of a single author does not conflict with the understanding that the sources of the Bible were drawn from archives of Israelite and Judahite kings, as well as Mesopotamian and Canaanite and other sources. Wagenbaum claims that the traditional scholarly hypotheses of authorship and origins of the Bible are in fact secular rationalizations of cultural myths about the Bible. Let us imagine that Judea has now been conquered for a century, and its sacerdotal class is now fully Hellenized. A man educated in the Greek fashion, perhaps in Alexandria, has grown up learning all the Greek classics, Homer, Hesiod, Herodotus, the great tragic playwrights, Plato, and that which he may have read in the Alexandrian canon, established by Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothrace. He wants to create a literary work that can compete with those he has read, one that will give birth to his political and religious utopia, Israel. On the one hand, theories about the origins of the Bible tend to admit that the same writer wrote some books. On the other hand, several books and articles compare Greek myths with the Bible. It is the absence of a synthesis of all these data that is questioned here. Could it be the other way around? Philip Wagenbaum rejects the alternative suggestion that it may have been the Greeks who were influenced by the Bible or related stories from cultures neighboring the Jews. Essentially, the reasons for resisting this idea are: 1, Greek authors were generally identifiable personally, and they quite openly referred to their predecessors and contemporaries whom they emulated and imitated. They had no need to copy the Bible and leave no evidence that they had any awareness of it. 2, the Greeks portrayed their myths through painting and sculpture, and here there is no suggestion of borrowing from Jewish myths. The only contemporary images from Palestine are Canaanite relics. 3, Wagenbaum argues that almost every chapter of the Bible corresponds to a Greek myth, whereas the opposite is not true. 4, Greek myths are linked together in a logical narrative progression from the birth of the gods themselves down to the Trojan War and the beginnings of the historical era. This rich and complex intertextuality has allowed the biblical writer to create an original epic on a fantastic level of sophistication. We will see how the Greek mythical genealogies have been dismantled and reconstructed through a specific filter. I hope that everybody watching this goes and subscribes to Neil Godfrey's blog. He is doing fantastic work mining scholars that are not well known, and we're highlighting them today. Please show him your appreciation. Show Russell Gmirkin. Much of his work was shown in this documentary, and I want more people to show support to the good scholars we bring forward here on Myth Vision. To be continued. As we unravel the intricate narratives of the Bible, it becomes increasingly evident that understanding Abraham's tale requires a detour through the annals of Hellenistic lore. This synthesis of Greco-biblical traditions isn't merely an exercise in historical curiosity, but a pivotal key to truly grasping the layers and intricacies of biblical narratives. If today's exploration has piqued your interest, I urge you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join the conversation in the comments below. I hope you tell us what your favorite part of this video was. We're just scratching the surface, and there's so much more to uncover in our upcoming series on the origins of the Bible. To get exclusive content and early access to our episodes, consider supporting our quest by joining our Patreon community. You'd also become part of our family. Together, we'll navigate the rich tapestry of ancient narratives and the profound lessons they hold for the modern world. Until then, keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious. Oh, and never forget, we are Myth Vision.